Welcome to The Second Cup, Conversations After the Podcast. Today, we are talking with Stan Helton. Stan, can you speak to the importance of spirituality and spiritual formation at this time within the church and in this time in history?
I think as leaders within our various groups, one of the questions that really ought to be the centerpiece of how we frame ministry is the question: what kind of people are formed by the experiences that we share together, whether it's worship experiences, fellowship together, etc. And so I think leaders would do well to start some of their elders or otherwise, start your meetings thinking about what kind of people are being formed, because I've concluded some time ago that if we don't like the product, chances are it has something to do with the practices that are forming the people. And so if we are forming a cantankerous people, then there's something we're doing in our body life together that fosters that. So I think one of the questions that need to be in the forefront of spiritual formation is, first of all, to recognize that the church exists in some ways as the primary unit that God uses to spiritually form his people. I sometimes summarize the mission of God in this way, is that God's mission has always been to form a distinct people to live God's life for the sake of the world. And I think all of those pieces are important. But primarily this middle piece, which is forming a God-shaped people, a people that look like God. What does that look like? Several years ago, I had a chance to study the history of Christian spirituality, and a writer by the name of Urban Holmes has done some fascinating studies by looking at what has been the practices of the church in general. It's not really asking a biblical question, it's asking what has the church typically done in the area that we might call spiritual formation. And he found that there were 4 categories of spiritual formation that church universally has been involved in. And one of these sectors, he divided it in quadrants, but one of these quadrants was theological knowledge, which, of course, those of us in the Stone Campbell movement, we kind of majored in theological knowledge as if it's the pinnacle of salvation, as if you know the right things, then you've got to be saved, right? But
Right.
It's only one aspect of the totality. Holmes went on to see that not only has the church been involved historically in the notion of theological knowledge, it also has been involved, at least some segments of the church, in an attempt to have mystical union with God, that there is a actual connection with God that can be had, and that Christians throughout the year have talked about making themselves available. The interesting things is that with the fragmentation of Catholicism, these various practices tended to get fragmented among the churches. And so churches of Christ didn't have a lot of mystical union. We didn't talk about what it was like to be one with Christ. If we were talking about one, we were thinking unity in organization. We weren't really talking about unity of mind and heart and ways in which we could actually encounter God now. It was kind of like we were in the waiting zone between we've been baptized and one day we get to live with God, but God actually living with us now, that's not, well, the Bible speaks a lot to that. And so we have theological knowledge, we have mystical union. We also have this area that we might call the liturgical or the worship area, how we've expressed our devotion to God, which these categories can all mix together, because obviously you can't worship God without theological knowledge, but just a way of thinking, how has the church traditionally expressed itself in spirituality? And so there's worship or devotion to God. And then the last area that Holmes recognized was that the church has always felt like we should be involved in service of some kind, that we make a difference in the world that we live in somehow. And that all 4 of these somehow, if you were thinking of spirituality holistically, you'd want to give attention to all of these, not just one quadrant. And in my D-Min thesis, which I wrote in 2009, I actually attempted, and this is before the Jesus Creed was printed. So I had it in print in my dissertation before. Sorry, I can't think of the scholar's name right now who wrote the Jesus Creed. You guys can think. Scott McKnight.
Yes, Scott McKnight.
Yeah,
yes.
yeah. Yeah, so his book came out and said, well, there it is. I don't need to write it anymore. But anyway, these areas are really kind of convenient if you think about it. Theological knowledge is mind,
Hmm.
devotion is heart, mystical union is soul, and service is body or strength. And so there's
Mm.
really kind of an interesting way of thinking at it in terms of
Yeah.
how the Shema would inform it, that we are to love the Lord our God with everything we are. And
Yeah.
so I think if we could help spiritual leaders understand that that's really the task of spiritual formation, it's not the running of the church, it's not the multiplication of the church, it's actually the forming of a people, or at least, and again, we want to frame this right because our practices do create people,
Hmm.
but we don't want to be in the business of being the creator. We want to be in the business of being the facilitator that we participate with. We are formed as we help others be formed. And I
Yeah.
think using the passive more often will probably keep us theologically proper here as opposed to thinking we create people. But the fact is that our practices come together to form the kind of people we become.
Yeah.
And so if you want to change a church, you don't give them a new mission statement.
Hmm.
You invite them into some new practices.
I
Yeah,
like what you're saying there. You say it reminds me of a saying that says, "Your church is perfectly designed to produce the results that you're currently getting."
that
And
is
so,
true.
thinking about your church experience as a formative experience really helps us to think about things. I want to draw out a little bit. One of those quadrants you spoke to, the mystical union.
Yeah.
A lot of people I know have this kind of fear when it comes to that word mystical union,
Hmm.
that we're getting into some kind of Eastern non-Christian stuff. But throughout church history, we've had this idea of deification, theosis,
Hmm.
and I believe you've done a lot of work with Origen, one of the
I
church
have.
fathers, and he has some stuff to say about this theosis,
Yeah.
deification,
Yeah.
mystical union. Can you speak to a little bit about how that's been in our DNA from very
Oh,
early
sure.
on?
Sure. Let me share with you just briefly Origen's theological hermeneutical methodology. He believed that you could read Scripture on three levels. Level one was simply the text,
Hmm.
and he was looking for the text that would help you live, but he wasn't necessarily, but just the text. I mean, he's a textual critic, so he's trying to get the words exactly right. So he cares about that kind of stuff. But his next level is what he would call the psychic level or the bodily level, which is how the scripture informs our way of being. But his third level, he called spiritual.
Hmm.
And when one read scripture spiritually, one had the potential of actually literally encountering God. And that the purpose of scripture was to create conduits in which believers could um, actually touch God.
Hmm.
And so, no, it's deeply a part. Whether it's Christianity originally is an Eastern religion, we should remind ourselves, and so
Yeah, that's
we
true.
shouldn't. The amazing thing, and I learned this with my close encounters with some of my Pentecostal friends, is that God will, if you're a seeker, God will give you what you need, only as much as you need, or as much as you can process. But we all believe as Christians, even those that are the most academic, um, scholastic, we still believe the text teaches that we can actually have an encounter with God. I mean, we use the
Hmm.
language of relationship, but sometimes I'm not really sure we understand what we're implying by the word relationship.
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't think so. People should be scared of the mystical encounter of God, but there is a warning attached.
Hmm.
God will take you where you have to deal with yourself.
Yeah.
And so many of the mystics along the way found out that they went to the desert to fight the devil and found out that who they really had to fight was themselves.
Yep.
Yeah,
It's a terrifying. I think Henry Nouwen. I forget exactly how I said it, but it's a crucible.
it
Solitude
is.
and silence is a crucible where you basically do battle with the false self
Yeah.
that has to be cast off. When you speak to the
Well,
devotion part, that heart quadrant, um, James K. A. Smith, wonderful
yes.
book, Desiring the Kingdom, talks about
Yeah.
these formative experiences. He uses the example of a football game and how football games are designed to form our thinking and our way of life
Hmm.
in a certain way.
Hmm.
You go to a shopping mall, and shopping malls are designed to form us in a certain way through a lot of different things. In churches, we typically have a few ways that we think of that we're trying to be formed into Christ through this. What are some overlooked ways that the church
Uh-huh.
experience is forming us in certain directions, either towards Christ or away from Christ? And how can we pay closer attention
Oh, those are.
to what we're doing in that space that are formative?
Let me give another analogy for us. Medical schools are designed to create doctors.
Right.
And we think of doctors in terms of having the right knowledge for sure,
Mhm.
right? But schools are also interested in forming certain kind of doctors, doctors who have good skills with their patients, who have certain dispositions. And I would say that from that analogy, as we think of how we're forming people within the life of the congregation, we need to ask what kind of people, what habits do we want to see, what dispositions, what instincts. I think the gospel gives certain instincts that help us navigate, particularly where we don't have clear scripture on how to handle something, that we have gospeled instincts that
Hmm.
can take over and tell us the most probable way to move forward. There's always a discernment process involved, but
Yeah.
I think if we were to actually give attention to, let's say, what do we give attention to? Oh, show up on time, listen to the sermon. You know, one of the things that has really amazed me about the way church has formed for many of us is that church has become a spectator sport, trying to get the same things out of us that a football game is.
Yeah.
And I'm not really sure those are the kind of things we're looking for.
Yeah.
So, what practices could one invite in that would say, I'm going to be kind to strangers? And shouldn't church look more like practicing the skills we need for life as opposed to just hearing? And listen, I've done a lot of professional development over the last couple of years, and my voice, I may get heard one day. Listening to someone talk is not training.
Yeah. And yet we call our worship space typically an auditorium,
Yeah, for
you
here,
know,
yeah, because we're there to
and
hear.
we're there to hear and listen and be passive. And yet I forget the author's name, Scandretti maybe,
Yeah,
talked about church as a dojo, a Jesus dojo, where,
yeah,
you go to a dojo, you are trained through practices and exercise to build
hmm
those reflexes, to build those instincts to become a black belt or whatever.
uh-huh,
The way you're speaking of church, we are supposed to be trained to have those same instincts as Christ, having the same mind as Christ, and we typically don't think of it in that
uh,
way.
uh-huh,
There's a lot more that we could be doing as church leaders, as
yeah,
Christians, to help each other to become
yeah,
formed into the image of Christ. And I love that emphasis on that.
yeah. Hey, Drew, have you had a chance to read Kreider's book on the patient ferment
No.
of the church? He argues that in the first couple of centuries, the church was an experience that formed a kind of people that could face death without fear.
Wow.
And so
Great
that
quote.
whatever they were doing in the life of the church, the early church, they were forming a people that impressed the Romans by the way they faced death.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's great.
And I'm not so sure that if we were under intense persecution, we would be ready for that experience. At least not in
Yeah.
North America.
I want to speak to the service, strength, the service component that you talked about. In my experience, I've witnessed ways of serving that are counterproductive
hmm
to the Christ formed life, and some that are actually much more effective in
Yeah.
forming a, a Christ like attitude. Have you seen that in your experience? And what would be the fundamental differences between the two kinds of serving?
Well, one of my litmus tests for whether or not an act of service is genuine is, have you asked the people being served what they actually need and
Right.
what they actually want?
It seems basic, and yet.
But it's the missing ingredient in so much of what goes on for evangelicals decide a community needs to be renovated. Well,
Mhm,
you need to ask the people who are living there. They may actually be quite happy with the way things are. They just don't.
mhm.
They just don't fit your standard. And so, I think acts of service are done in participation with the people that are being ultimately served, and ultimately
Yeah,
you're being served by
participation in
being
the
able to serve. But But
Hmm.
and it takes real skills to do this. Um, Jonathan Straker, who does some work for us here, he one of our adjunct professors. He was in Sendai, Japan during the earthquake, the nuclear reactor meltdown and all that.
Hmm.
And he'll often say churches do a real good job on first aid, but they don't know what to do to form communities again.
Yeah.
And so we're usually deficit on. It's easy to provide water and blankets. It's much harder to begin to realize um, what it's going to take, and are we willing to, and do we have the patience to walk along with people as they begin to reorganize life together. And so the primary question when we help people is not what you need, but what do you have, and what would you like to do with it, and how can we help you with that?
Oh, I love that.
Yeah,
That takes a different stance, a stance of walking alongside,
yeah,
being willing to accept as well as give. Too
yeah,
many service activities are us here, you
yeah.
there, um, and there's a clear delineation between the servers and the servees, and
Uh-huh.
I just don't think that's helpful or I don't think that's what Christ modeled. I think he gave and he also received,
Yeah.
and I think that's what we need to do as well.
This is where I think some of the post colonial critique is really helpful to the life of the church, because even in our mission efforts over the last couple of 100 years, we've always gone as if we were the providers.
Right.
We need to now learn what it means to be the guest,
Hmm.
not the host.
Yeah.
Yeah,
It goes right back to the nature of the incarnation, Christ being
exactly.
one of us, putting on flesh, and we got to be willing to do the same and cross barriers and
Uh-huh.
become one of the people that we're serving. So
Yeah.
wonderful thoughts.
Yeah. In terms of practical terms, just do things. Don't come together for a Bible study. Come together for a small group fellowship. Figure out new ways of doing things. Go out and prayer walk the community. But you got to be careful with that one. In fact, it was funny because I had a group that wanted to do prayer walk in an indigenous community, and I said, and how do you think four white people walking together within their community, how do you think that's going to be received? Yeah, because you want the things that you do to serve people, and that is to bless them. You want them to be able to say, it blessed me.
Yes.
Yeah.
That's wonderful. Well, thank you so much,
Yeah.
Stan. This has been
Great.
a
Great being
wonderful
with you.
conversation. Definitely a needed conversation, and one that I think people are hungry for. Spiritual formation is something that we need, and I think we've known that we needed. We just didn't know how to talk about it.
Mm-hmm.
And so you've really given us some great ways to talk about this that can really help us to become more like Christ. So I really appreciate what you're doing. Thanks.